So I just got the Arturia KeyLab 88 Mark II Black Edition for use with my Pro Tools rig, and this is a great keyboard controller, best in class. It's got 88 weighted keys, a whole host of controls for your DAW, including transport buttons, sliding faders and coder knobs, track selectors, velocity-sensitive trigger pads, and dedicated command controls. It also comes with Analog Lab 4 and Analog Lab 5 software, as well as several dedicated instruments, Piano V2, Whirly V2, and Vox Continental V2. The Arturia keyboards work in 3 modes: Analog Lab, DAW, and User. The DAW mode for Pro Tools is a Huey emulation, and it is spot on. All the controls work exactly as advertised. So that includes solo, mute, record arm, read and write for automation, saving your work, switching to punch mode, swapping controls between the mix view and the timeline view, and also a dedicated undo. Something to know about the KeyLab Mark II is that the user and analog modes are additive with the DAW mode. The user and analog lab modes use standard Midi as opposed to the Huey protocol that the DAW mode uses. But once you set your DAW up, the transport controls always work even if you switch to user or analog lab mode. And the dedicated DAW commands will stay with your DAW unless you have used the MIDI Control Center software to turn them into user or programmable buttons. Both the user and analog lab modes remap your track knobs, your faders, your selector buttons, and in the user mode, remember, you can have 3 banks of these controls, so there are actually 27 addressable controls of each type. The user mode can also remap your trigger pads. You can store up to 10 completely different user mode scenes in the unit memory, and you can store as many on your computer as you like and write up to 10 of them to the KeyLab's onboard memory whenever you want. So this is all great, but I was missing a few workflow pieces that I really prefer. I wanted the ability to pan both the left and right on stereo channels. I wanted to be able to drop markers on the timeline when I'm playing or recording, and I wanted to at least open and close plugin windows. But on top of this, with my previous controller, I could also control things like send levels. After some research I used for my previous controller, I learned a lot about how to use MIDI to support M-Audio's hyper control functions to do all of these things and more. So with all that, I figure I could just map some MIDI controller change messages to the various hardware controls in the KeyLab, and I figured I'd be good to go, right? Wrong. Unfortunately, some of the MIDI controller numbers used by M-Audio Hypercontrol, some of them reuse other standard MIDI control numbers, and often those are controller numbers automatically mapped in Analog Lab and other software synths as well. So that means, for example, if I changed a pan or a fader on a track and Analog Lab was open or working, I'd also be changing the cutoff frequency or the part volume at the same time, or vice versa. The same thing would happen if I was messing with Analog Lab mode on the controller. Faders and pan knobs would start moving in my DAW. It was like having a ghost in the machine. So here's the problem. How do I get all these controls working the way I like while also not overlapping the Analog Lab and MIDI-based DAW control so they could work independently? Once again, the world's greatest MIDI utility, MidiPipe, came to the rescue. And MidiPipe is amazing. It can monitor and analyze MIDI messages from every component of your system, and it can do all sorts of things like reroute or change them or trigger additional MIDI messages based on the content. And you can even do things like launch Apple scripts to automate tasks. I configured a set of MIDI pipes that take care of all these workflow tasks now, and I'm passing these on for free to you. There's only one thing you need to do, which is configure your Mac and Pro Tools with a few simple steps for these pipes to work for you. So the first thing you need to do is download the files I've provided using the link underneath the video. There's a MidiPipe file and a configuration file for your Arturia KeyLab Mark II. Next, make sure your KeyLab Mark II controller is attached to your system via USB. Then you're going to go to your Audio MIDI utility in Mac OS X. Click on the icon for the IAC driver and then hit the I icon for information. Make sure the IAC driver is online and that it has at least 2 ports or buses activated. If you don't have 2, use the plus control to add a port if needed. Then hit apply. You can quit the utility now. Everything that you've done is saved, and it'll automatically be there when you start your computer up next time. Next, if you don't have it already, download the MidiPipe utility using the link provided underneath this video as well. you can drag MidiPipe to your applications folder to install it. And once it's installed, start it up and open the configuration files you downloaded. Now, what you're going to do is check the MIDI ins and outs on each of the pipes. Even though I have preset these, you want to make sure that they are set correctly on your machine as well. If you have different numbers of MIDI devices, it's possible these could change, and so it's really important that you have these correct. So to do this, after you've opened the configuration file, look up on the right side and you'll see the list of pipes there. There are 4 pipes. We're going to check the MIDI in and MIDI out settings on each pipe. The KeyLab Huey to Huey pipe should have its input from the KeyLab DAW port, and its output should be IAC driver bus 1. The KeyLab MIDI to MIDI pipe should have input from the KeyLab MIDI port and output to IAC driver bus 2. The KeyLab MIDI to Huey should have its input from the KeyLab MIDI port and output to IAC driver bus 1. The KeyLab MIDI to Key Macros pipe should have input from the KeyLab MIDI port. Now, don't quit this application once you're done. Leave it running, but you can hide it using Command H if you want. However, if you switched any of the ports that are used in any of the MIDI in or MIDI out configurations here, you need to resave this configuration so you'll be able to use it next time. Hit Command S or go to File Save in order to do that. Now, before you go on, I also would ask that you donate money to the MidiPipe software author because he is providing seriously one of the best Swiss Army knife tools for MIDI and studio engineers that you will find. And it's entirely free. He does it just for the love of doing it. But he does have a PayPal donate button, so go to the website, click on the PayPal donate button, and give the guy some money. Come on, do it. Do it. Next, we're going to configure Pro Tools. Go to Setup Preferences in the menu. In the Operation tab, make sure the numerical keypad is operating in classic mode, not transport mode. Then select OK. Next, go to Setup Peripherals in the menu. And in the MIDI Controllers tab, you're going to set up 2 controllers. The first should be a Huey receiving from IAC driver bus 1 and sending to your KeyLab's DAW port. The second is an M audio keyboard receiving from IAC driver bus 2 and sending to your KeyLab's MIDI port. Select OK when you're done. Now open up your Arturia MIDI Control Center software. Hit Import to copy the KeyLab MkII configuration file that you downloaded from me into your library. Store the configuration to an empty user slot on your controller. Remember, this configuration will overwrite any controls in that slot, and that includes settings for all the pads, knobs, faders, and selector buttons. So do make sure to write it to an empty part. So now if you switch to user mode on your KeyLab MkII and select the appropriate preset, you will see a colorful set of pads and the 5th DOM Pro Tools name for your new preset. Now, do note that this slot uses MIDI channel 1 for all messages. If you need that to be different, you'll need to change both the KeyLab configuration for the user MIDI channel and all of the MidiPipe Apple scripts. To do that, just set the 176 value for any controller change message you see in the Apple scripts to 175 plus whatever MIDI channel you intend to use instead. And there's a whole other video on the way, and that's going to show you how to use these hyper control functions. Once you learn them, you can get really fast at your session work. All right, well, I hope these configurations have helped, and stay tuned for the next video to see what you can do with all this cool gadgetry.